Hey, welcome everyone. Thank you for these amazing artists also joining us. I remember I was in high school and I went to my guidance counselor. And also being like a child of immigrants was pretty rough on me as well. But going to my guidance counselor, I was really approached the guidance counselor and I said, "Oh, I'm really interested in science and art. Is there a job for me out there?" And this was, not to date myself, 1998. And the guidance counselor was like, "No, there's nothing like that." And the thing about scientists and artists, I always feel like it's like, at some point in their lives, I feel like someone said no to them on some point. And if you look at it, in a lot of kind of popular, amazing scientists out there, they had to go through a lot of adversity to get where they were. And I think that speaks a lot to get that gusto. To be denied something, it really makes you kind of want to strive to prove whoever said no to you wrong. With that said, we're here to talk about augmented reality and virtual reality. My personal forte is augmented reality. I have a company with Google. We're developing kind of the core technologies in terms of augmented reality that helps a lot of these artists create what they want to create as well. And so I just want to kind of throw it out there. And augmented reality means a lot of things. It means it means a lot of things to a lot of people. But one thing that it is a paradigm shift in terms of technology. There's been paradigm shifts through time, such as television, radio, internet, smartphones, and the next paradigm shift I truly believe is augmented reality. When it truly becomes accessible to all of us, it is going to change our lives in such an impactful way. And with augmented reality and just about any sort of technology shifts, there are the large corporations that will feed you ads at some point. I'm sure Google will do it as well, and I will have a hand in it. But something that's true and near dear to me is how artists embrace this technology. And I want to open this out to say, what is the impact of augmented reality as it comes to the forefront into the common kind of into the common people almost? How will art impact this new medium? And if anyone wants to take that.
Well, I would just speak to this idea of giving us the ability to tell untold stories. I mean, I think there's going to be a lot of AR garbage. I mean, ads and garbage. And and slander, and I mean, there's all kinds of ways it'll be abused. But I think the real potential is in storytelling and in illuminating and truly like augmenting, in the truest sense, either an experience, a site, or a story.
Sure.
I think to add to that too, it's really easy to start getting into the dystopian future world, but we're not even quite a foot in the door of the technology yet. So I find it to be a kind of still, as people have been calling it, the Wild West forever with VR and AR. VR is still that way. AR is just beginning to be that way. So I think it's an encouragement to be able to, yes, speak your words that you want to speak in a new medium that is not yet controlled. And maybe it can't be controlled. Talk to your people at Google about
that. Above my pay grade.
I know nothing about AR.
Oh.
I know a little bit about AR. We've been talking about doing an AR version for the Cell project, but my world is more the audio side of things, and that's the big sort of concern for me, which is the HoloLens has pretty good sound capabilities. In some ways, audio was already AR, and I'm really curious to see what happens with the audio side of that, if it reaches the public. I mean, obviously, AR is going to reach the public more through phones at first,
sure,
and that sort of thing.
So already is on some level.
Yeah. So that's the only thing I would have to add to that. I haven't worked enough in it to be able to speak to it.
I also think that we need to even democratize it more than just a phone, because a phone is still very expensive. So trying to think about augmented reality in this way that's more utilitarian, like your piece where people are sharing phones, is beautiful. And I think that we need to think about, like, I don't know the answer to this. I just put this out to a bunch of people at University of Washington. I was like, what would AR be if it wasn't through a phone? Like, what would it be so it could be more available to more people across the world and not just in our small kind of society here, for instance, or outside, in California, where we do have cell phones, and a lot of people still don't have them. So that's kind of something I like to think about.
Yeah, I think one thing about VR is it's inclusive, where augmented reality is exclusive to everywhere. And
do you mean that in reverse? I think you mean that in reverse.
Sure. Okay. With
VR is exclusive.
VR, you're living in your own world, right?
Right,
With
that's
augmented
exclusive.
reality, you're sharing the world
It's
and what's laid upon top of it. And that just doesn't mean graphically. It means audio. Even when you get a geo-targeted ad, that is an augmented reality. Your reality is being changed by your location of where you are. And I think there's a whole kind of range of what augmented reality could be as well. But the democratization is something that I truly kind of worry about, and who has access to this. And I think you touched upon this as well, which the accessibility of XR is something that's truly kind of worrying me as well. And if you want to maybe kind of...
Well, I was just on a panel at VRAR Vancouver, and I was on a tech panel, and I'm just sitting next to someone from Niantic, Eighth Wall, and somebody else from somewhere else. And everybody's talking about the cloud, the AR cloud. Great, awesome. 5G, awesome. Guess what? That's not going to be accessible to most people for a long time. Right. Or if you're in a remote place or you're in a rural place. I mean, we've done the best we can with Fourth Wall. I mean, you got to have a success or above. And we've done as much community engagement and programming as possible. However we can, but that it remains an issue, and it's actually going to take time more than anything else.
Sure.
And glasses are even less accessible right now.
I see the phone as the most accessible. Generally, no matter what, you're still going to have access to a smartphone or a phone in general. But once you go into VR, it tends to be a little more exclusive in terms of what's available to you. And I think that's one of those things that's kind of people need to be conscious about, especially with these new technologies, is who gets access to them, how they get distributed and so forth like that. It's super important. Yeah. But on a lighter note, so a lot of these, especially technologies, are a combination of science and art. And one thing I really, especially has been near and dear to me as well, is what is the role of an artist when it comes to science? Where does the science start, or where does the science end and the interpretation of the artist begins? And I'll throw that out.
I think that it's quite cyclical. I mean, you could translate that into an everyday thing that we do in my lab, which is have the conversation between design and engineering or development, right? So ideally, it's a cyclical world where each and every one of the people can speak a language together. But sometimes there are misunderstandings. Sometimes there are times when the circle breaks, but then it comes back together. So I see the same thing as a person that is trained. I went to art school, so I studied film and video and new media. But my whole entire career has been in the programming world, because new media at that time meant internet stuff. I always show a gif of like a hedgehog surfing on a wave, because I feel like it was just like anything is possible. And for me, that was like, yeah, that doesn't make sense, what I just said. I feel like you guys know what I'm talking about. Hedgehog is surfing on a wave. Yeah, it's art. That's my art brain. But I think it's the constant kind of conversation and communication. And I mean, I would like to know more about your process about when you were talking and you mentioned your team. It's like, how often do you check in? I'm sure it's like you all are just a big happy family of like conversations at 3 a.m. on the phone.
We are literally a happy family. Like my sister is one of my tech partners. I mean, literally. I would say that, first of all, just to circle back, everything to me begins with curiosity. And if you're curious, that's where you have these points of intersection. And I would say our points of intersection with my team have to do with an unwillingness to accept no as an answer. And so I sort of generate all the raw materials and the conceptual stuff, and then together we execute it. And it is really collaborative. It's deeply collaborative. And I think that the collaborative process, that whole thing, somebody was talking earlier about art and science together, you have to have those points of intersection, or you're right, the circle breaks.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, in the past, I worked at the Field Museum of Natural History. That was really my first career. and I worked in the media department doing exhibitions, and those wonderful meetings where you're like the artist being like, okay, so I know you've studied this for 35 years and have a PhD in it, but I'm going to make a 1-minute video about it for the public to completely understand. And they're just like, boom, mic drop. Like, no, what are you talking about? But then, it becomes a process where they're like, okay, let's like cut some corners, and I maybe don't have to be as serious about leaving this in. And at the end, there's a product that both are happy with, and then the public gets to understand as well. But the road there is like 6 months of pulling your hair out. But it's fully worth it, because that communication is what continues to be successful when you talk about this combination of art and science.
Sure. I think studying, I studied computational mathematics, and there was a lot of differential equations and linear algebra that just was, it was just kind of formulas that I had to understand. But after graduating, I think even with more of the internet kind of picking up on this sort of stuff, I started seeing video representations or animation representations of these mathematical formulas, and then I was like, oh my God, now I get what I was like learning about, And I think, again, those are artistic representations of science that I think truly makes it accessible or understandable as well.
Yeah, I mean, I would say that's a completely legitimate way to go, but I would qualify that as, especially in the realm of praxis, where you have artists and scientists working together, as more like advocacy, right? It's a way that artists sort of get hired on as like guns for hire to communicate science principles, which is completely legitimate. Right. But I know,
Brian, you were saying how there was kind of a little bit of a misunderstanding between the artists and scientists working on your project.
Right, and that sometimes, the especially there were a couple of remarks earlier that I found really interesting, which is in the opening, which is that, it's not the flour or the dough, it's the bread, right? Which I think is true. Art science is the emergent domain but a lot of times we sort of pay lip service to that without asking, how is that bread baked? And the way that bread is baked, I think, is through a true hybridized methodology. And that requires something, that many artists aren't well practiced at, which is to be explicit about what their methodologies are. And to identify those practices and their methodologies that aren't about what was the term used earlier? It's not about increasing uncertainty, but it's actually like decreasing uncertainty. I mean, there are plenty of things that artists do to decrease uncertainty. I mean, linear perspective is a way of decreasing uncertainty. Where is that thing in space? Well, now I have a system by which I can place an object in space. And so there are plenty of examples of that, and I think it requires artists to be explicit about their methods and their methodologies, and for kind of good faith on either side, to be able to come together and do that. So what's the artist's role? I mean, what's the scientist's role? I think both of our roles are to find out what we can do together, and not necessarily what one side can do for the other.
I always feel that science has a very hard kind of rigor to it almost, and again. But through that rigor, we were just talking about this a bit ago, about how through that rigorous kind of understanding, you lose something, where by quantifying the world around you, you lose that magic. And I think that's where artists come back in and try to inject that little, that je ne sais quoi. But
I find a lot of beauty out of, my experience of mathematics is through coding, and so before I learned to code, I found math very difficult. And the more I've learned about mathematics in particular, the more I get awestruck by particular equations. That is so beautiful. Like the simplicity can be awe-inspiring in many ways.
We can talk about the algorithm PTEM that made AR possible first, which is quite a beautiful algorithm in itself. It's very small, but very mighty. And it's why we're all here right now. So, sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you, but talking about pretty equations, I was like, let me tell you.
Yeah, sure, math is very much an underpinning of all computer science in general, and it is a type of math in itself,
But also, I would just argue that artists are every bit as rigorous.
I would agree with you there.
Absolutely.
It was funny when I was getting my again going for my master's, it was in computer science. And I went to my professors and I was like, this is my art medium. And they were like, they just didn't get it. Again, one of those.
Blew their minds.
Yeah, they were just like, what do you mean it's your medium? And I'm like, well, I want to use this to tell a story, to express myself. And they were just like, it's not like that. And I was like, I don't know. I kind of feel like it is, you know?
Let me have feelings.
I got feelings. The code has feelings too. Okay, we're quite running up.
I think
Do
we're
we have
almost
more
done.
time? I would love to keep talking, honestly.
I think we only have a minute.
Okay, all right. In terms of art and science, in terms of democratization, what is it as an artist and as a scientist, what is our responsibility to give back to people? 2-minute answer or 1 minute, 1-line answer from everybody.
Well, for me, it's just giving them their own, like, choice and agency and inviting them into a conversation and not making it exclusive. And that you can do that most effectively, in my opinion, through AR as a public art medium.
Mm.
I think it's also from, the point of JPL, we provide assets for people to create things with. And I feel like I say that and kind of hammer it into people, but no one actually goes and does it unless they're comfortable with it. So I think something that's really important that needs to happen is to make kind of game engines and all of those things more accessible to more people so that they can experiment and have more software available more democratically, for that not to be a scary entry point, to be like, I'm going to make a ball that bounces that's going to turn into, like, I'm going to make, our whole entire galaxy in AR.
Mm.
Yeah, I mean, I would say that those are very material constraints, and certainly people need to get better access to the technologies. But I think there's also a constraint on thinking, and this idea that, like, somehow science belongs to a particular kind of person or a particular group of people, and art belongs to, and I think that what art science does when it does anything well is it shows that these knowledge domains don't belong to anyone, they belong to everyone, that anyone can enter into those spaces and be productive and be creative, whether it's through equations or through painting or whatever it is.
Yeah, I would say that I totally agree with that because, I think if you're a female specifically working in an engineering field, we've all heard that you don't look like you work here. You do not look like you're an engineer. And it's always like, oh man, all right, here we go. I'm going to go nuts right now. It's like, now I'm confident and I can, hold my ground. But, there was a long time where I didn't feel that way. And I think just breaking those bounds of that for all across both things. Like, you don't have cool glasses, you're not an artist. Like, come on, man.
Yeah, and I would just, to build on that, I would say that, inviting people to make their own work, as you said before, and to make their own context and content. Everyone has some creative thread. Even the people that just put it up over their bed or over their whatever, it's still an expression.
Right.
And more creativity is good, period.
Yeah.
Yes.
Cool.
All right, thank you so much.
Okay, thank you everybody.